You know that feeling when life throws you a curveball and suddenly everything you were staying consistent with just falls apart. You're not alone, but instead of letting that derail you completely, I want to share how you can keep moving forward even when life gets messy. Most people think staying on track is pushing through no matter what, but the truth is that all or nothing mindset is probably what's holding you back. So let's talk about how to keep momentum even when life gets on top of you. So I personally recently was in flow, I was doing my thing, I was feeling good. And all of a sudden, I felt myself start to get really run down and I ended up having a cold, so much so that it sort of started to grind me to a halt. However, I had found I was in a flow of momentum and I just didn't want to stop things completely. And so I had to really take a step back and think about how I could move forward through this period. And through that, I decided to create what I'm now going to call a pivot plan. Hello friends, this is a new episode of Voice Notes from Samio, and you might be wondering, what is a pivot plan? A pivot plan is a plan, quite simply, for when life pivots, those unexpected changes outside of your control. And this is really just to help counteract that all or nothing mentality, which I myself have been guilty of on more than one occasion, but no more. We are moving forward. And so this is to help combat that so you can keep moving forward instead of stopping completely. So for me personally, in the past, I have created momentum when I've been in a space where things have been going well and feeling flow. And then when external factors have pivoted for whatever reason, I've not really had steps in place to then maintain that momentum under those circumstances. And so often I've dropped all the plates and really struggled to get back into the flow. So this time around, I was like, we cannot be doing that again because I'm sick of stop starting. And with this podcast in particular, I am not stopping. I'm giving myself a year. I said that out loud. And so in this space, I really had to have a little bit of real talk with myself. So this will bring us nicely to step one of the pivot plan. Step one is to decipher your threshold of tolerance. So what this looks like is setting up a scale of 0 to 10. You can write this down, you can do it in your head, but see 0 as everything's fine, you can continue on as normal, and 10 could be something like a tragedy in the family, a serious health issue, basically whatever it is for you that feels like a high level of impact that means you completely have to stop and you can't continue on for whatever reason. And you might have varying degrees along the scale in the middle. And this will look different to everyone because this is very personal to you and what you feel you can deal with and keep up the momentum despite what's going on around you. And obviously with this scale, you can't often decipher this until you come to it. So I'm not suggesting you create a scale and put every potential event on there, but reflecting on past experiences and how you've been able to show up in those events might give you a little bit of an idea of how realistic it is for you to do certain tasks during those times. And again, I'm not expecting you to set out a plan for if something severely bad happens. This scale might only be relevant to do in the moment. But for me, as someone who can really get in their feels, and I'm not going to lie, I can be a little bit dramatic at times, it was a really good way to put things into perspective. So I am not a great sick person. When I have a cold, I feel very sorry for myself. And I do kind of ground to a halt, which is absolutely fine because I do really believe rest is important. And actually, it is really what I needed in that week. But there are also levels to the things that I am able to maintain during that time. I might not be able to put my full energy into talking to camera and creating content like this. But there are other things I'm able to maintain behind the scenes in that scenario. So for me, looking at that scale, and again, this is very personal, it could be a completely different number to you, but a cold, which I had on this particular week, it was quite a bad cold to be fair. I would maybe put that at 5, at least for the first few days when I had very little energy and I really did need to rest. And so I knew I had to then adjust my output accordingly and I wouldn't necessarily be moving at full speed. And this just allowed me to gauge the level of effort I was able to maintain. I like to see this as fitting the right tires for a car so that when you go over a stone or a rock, depending on the size of the problem, it doesn't necessarily have to break down your car or send you completely off-road and into a ditch. Step 2 is to simplify the way you show up. So once you have deciphered your threshold of tolerance, this will help you have a little think of how you are able to move forward and in which areas. And again, this will be very different depending on the external factors that are affecting you at this moment in time. But I think having that gauge really helps, because this is what's going to get us away from that all or nothing mentality. I know personally in the past, I would build momentum at a certain level, and then when things got tough or things happened, I would really struggle to move forward and everything would completely fall off. So this is all about making that plan to enable you to keep showing up in a way that works for you, even when all the external factors maybe aren't quote unquote perfect at that time. So it might be that you can't show up 100% in the way that you usually would, but it's about asking yourself, okay, well, can I show up 60% here or even 50% in a way that allows you to keep moving forward and keep going with whatever it is that you're trying to maintain at this point in time. And this applies to both effort and number of tasks, and this will be different for each individual. But say, for example, you have a family emergency that you need to attend to, but you do still have a limited amount of time that you are able to work on whatever it is that you're working on. So it might be that your percentage reduction is relating to the number of tasks, but actually when you show up to said tasks, you're able to give 100%. Someone else, on the other hand, might be able to show up to 100% of the tasks, but only able to give 50% of the effort. So you really have to work out what it is for you, but you have to remember that showing up in some way is better than not showing up at all, because this is all about keeping that momentum, and it's much harder to get back into things after a pause than it is to have just pulled back a little bit and kept going. And then obviously you can build it up again over time once the circumstances allow that. Another thing is, when we stop, I think we underestimate how hard it is to get back into the swing of things again and build that momentum. The momentum is a bit like the ball rolling downhill, right? It goes and it keeps going faster and faster and faster. But just like when a ball stops, you have to really give it some force, or you have to give it a kick to get it going again and get it on that downhill momentum. That's probably the worst analogy I've ever made, but I hope you get what I'm trying to say. And so I think that by maintaining a level of consistency, it then makes it that bit easier to build things back up again, as opposed to when we have fully stopped, because we're still in that motion and we're still in that habit of continuing on. And I think this pertains to so many different areas of life. And especially with me, like I was just saying the other day to my husband how I took a week off from filming, and then I sat in front of the camera and I felt so awkward and weird, even though this is something I've done for years. And it's because I'd slipped out of that momentum. And so I think just even allowing ourselves that practice keeps us in the swing of things and is really helpful in the long term. Even if in that moment you feel like, oh, I'm not doing enough, you're doing more than enough, or you're doing just as much as you can. And at the very least, you're showing up and you are continuing to keep going, which I think is really important. But again, at the level that you're able to do and at a level that you're able to maintain without pushing yourself beyond your limits or capacity at that particular time. I saw a TikTok earlier, and in it they shared a really good quote, and I thought I have to write that down because it actually relates to what I want to talk about here. And they said, first you need to make it exist, and then you can worry about making it good. And obviously that particular quote relates to starting something, but I also think it can really relate to building that momentum as well and keeping that momentum, especially if you're early on in your journey. Like me, for example, with this podcast, it's better for me to show up messily than it is to worry about making it perfect, because let's be so for real. For me with this podcast, for example, there's no point in me stressing about it being perfect when only a handful of people are listening to it anyway. So I may as well keep building that momentum now whilst I have a small audience in order to allow me to keep going. Because in the past, with so many projects I've worked on, I've stopped because I've not been able to keep that 100% effort or energy or whatever it may be when external factors have got in the way. And so it's completely derailed me and I've gone off course. And then to pick things back up again afterwards have been so hard. So right now my focus is keeping that momentum and showing up in the way in which I can. Number 3 is to prioritize the most important tasks. So once you've deciphered what you're able to maintain and to what level, out of those things, what is the number one most important task that is going to keep you on that momentum and actually get you closer to the thing that you're trying to achieve or trying to work on, whatever it is for you. And it's really important to identify this because this will help prevent some of that overwhelm, especially if you have a lot going on outside of what you're working on. It can be really hard to focus and manage a lot of tasks. So really getting clear on what that number one most important thing is to you will really help when a lot is going on. If you can only manage to do one task, at least you have that most important thing done and you're able to keep going with that. So for me, again, I'm going to use this podcast because that is the example we are working with today. I knew that I have content that I create on multiple platforms, but I'd made a promise to myself that this is something that I would put out every week on a Sunday. And so that is what I prioritized. Obviously, if I was super sick, I probably wouldn't have filmed it, but last week I got to a point where I felt well enough and I'd saved my energy so that I was able to record that because that was the most important task for me. And for me, that was super important because it meant that I didn't stop the thing that I promised to myself. And so now I'm able to continue on forward. And again, once you have prioritized that number one task, it's doing it at a level that you can maintain. Number 4 is reflect and rebuild. So once you're at a point where you're coming out of the other side of the challenge, things are getting a little bit easier again, you can start to rebuild yourself back up. And this is a really good time to reflect because depending on what your situation is, you may even need to rework your approach going forward. So if you're on a fitness journey and you've had an injury, it might mean that your training going forward will look different. Or if you have had a change in circumstances with family, it might mean that your approach to whatever you're focusing on might have to change. So for me personally, I know that my cold came off the back of approaching burnout, and I don't feel like I got to full-blown burnout. I've definitely experienced that before and it's not fun, but it was a little alarm bell, shall we say, like a little siren being like, oh, okay, you need a break now. And so I did have to listen to that. And like I say, I did pull back and I allowed myself to fully rest for a few days when I needed it. But that's really made me reflect and think about how I can rework the way I'm doing things moving forward and how I can place my energy into different tasks and to what level. So not only during the period where I wasn't feeling well, but then afterwards as well, because I don't want to then end up back in the same cycle. And so for me, this is something I'm still reflecting on at the moment. Again, what is my highest priority and how much can I maintain and sustain in the long term without ultimately burning myself out. And again, this may look very different to you depending on what your challenges are, but I think this is really important to take into account because sometimes we can set ourselves a standard and feel the pressure to maintain it and think, okay, well, I built momentum with that. I should be able to keep that momentum to that same level long term, especially if you did start to get a little bit of traction with whatever it was, whether it was fitness or work or whatever area of life. And so it can be really, really hard to say, you know what, I do have to pull back and actually this isn't sustainable long term. But it's really important to do that early on at a point where you can adapt and change before it becomes too late and you end up getting completely burnt out or it just becomes unenjoyable, because that's a big thing as well. Whatever journey you're on, you're supposed to enjoy the journey. So just make sure it doesn't get to a point where you absolutely hate it, and realize that you can adapt your approach while still on the same journey. And the final step, which is step 5, is to create an in hindsight action plan. I'm not going to lie, I had been toying around with the wording of that. But anyway, this is basically you creating an action plan to future-proof yourself. This is basically you reflecting on some of the past struggles to help future-proof yourself. So this lays out the steps of how you can do things better next time by learning from past hurdles. So in most circumstances, you kind of needed to have hit a road bump to get to this place where you can reflect. perfect. But I think even if you haven't had these speed bumps on this current journey, I'm sure there's been plenty of other times in life where stuff has maybe got in the way of certain goals or projects. And so you can even help future-proof yourself a little bit ahead of time, even if you haven't met any of those roadblocks yet on your current journey. So an example would be if you have fitness goals, this could look like creating a plan B workout instead of skipping exercise entirely. This is obviously for when things get hectic. It might be that you can do some smaller workouts at home. They could be lower impact. It could mean shorter, lower intensity workouts. And just having that backup plan, if you know you're someone that at times has to juggle a lot of things external to whatever you're working on, just having those backup, adaptable ways of approaching whatever it is that you're working on will allow you to keep going even when times are tough. And it's all good and well saying, oh, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. But often we are at such low capacity when our brain has to think of all these other things, especially if it's causing some level of stress. And again, going back to that scale, you can decide for how much you actually want to keep on working on your goal whilst external factors are going on. But if you are able to keep going, I think for when things do get hectic, already having this backup plan of things we can do to keep that momentum can be so helpful. And it allows us to not have to think about it too much. It's like, okay, I can't do my usual 100% plan A. In the meantime, how can I strip things back a little bit and do my plan B instead? And there could be other things that come up for you that you find could be really helpful too. It could include asking for help or working with other people at times when you need to. For me personally, I've realized it would really help me if I batch some content, not all content, but in certain areas. I think that is a way to take that load off and allow me to work slightly ahead of schedule so that when speed bumps do come along, I am able to keep some of that momentum. Maybe not as much with my podcast, because I do think it can be helpful to have conversations in real time, but especially some of my content on other social media platforms, for example. And another one I wrote is to keep a list of easier to execute ideas for busier times. And this is something I actually need to do because coming up over the summer, I'm noticing my calendar is starting to look a little bit busier. And again, in the past, this is when I've been known to fall off completely because I haven't really made a structured plan of how I'm going to navigate these periods. And so I just panic and I completely drop the ball. Whereas this time I'm really thinking ahead and having that hindsight mindset, shall we say, of how am I able to keep showing up through these periods? Because sometimes the life getting busy isn't always the bad things. The celebratory moments can be just as disruptive, especially if you're on a fitness journey or something like that. And so I think just having this mindset of allowing ourselves to adapt through certain periods is really important and it's really helpful. And I know I waffle on about it so much, but again, it goes back to that being a little bit less of a perfectionist. If you haven't seen it already, I do recommend my video that I did all about perfectionism and the ways it is ruining your life because it can hold you back in so many ways. I will link that episode in the description. But I'm a big believer now in showing up for yourself and taking that messy action and obviously being kind to yourself through it all, because like I say, this is not about pushing through and getting to burnout and feeling like you're trying to go at 100 miles per hour when really you do need to pull back. But it's also about keeping that trust with yourself and keeping that momentum that you've worked so hard to build, because you deserve that. I deserve that. We deserve to keep showing up. So that's all I've got for you today. I hope you found this episode helpful. If you create a pivot plan, please do let me know and let me know what you are trying to maintain momentum with. Hopefully we can encourage each other on this one. We are all about that momentum life this year. We're going to keep going. We're going to keep it rolling. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave a 5-star rating and review as it is super helpful. And please do subscribe wherever you are watching or listening. And then I will speak to you next time.